Welcome to the listening room, a quiet place for long-form thought, calm exploration, and deep understanding. Settle in, and let's begin. Stress is one of the most familiar experiences in human life, yet it is also one of the least understood. We talk about being stressed as if it were simply a feeling, a busy week, a difficult conversation, a lack of sleep, too many responsibilities pressing at once. But beneath that everyday language lies something far more consequential. Stress is not merely an emotion. It is a full-body biological state, a survival system that alters chemistry, perception, memory, attention, and behavior. And when it persists long enough, it begins to reshape the brain itself. This topic matters because stress is not rare or exceptional. It is ordinary. It accumulates quietly through deadlines, uncertainty, financial pressure, health concerns, family responsibilities, social tension, and the constant background noise of modern life. Unlike acute dangers faced by our ancestors, a storm, a predator, a sudden threat, many of today's stressors do not end quickly. They linger. They repeat. They become the environment in which a person lives rather than a temporary disturbance from which one recovers. When that happens, the brain adapts. And the adaptation is not neutral. A brain repeatedly exposed to stress does not simply endure it. It reorganizes around it. Neural pathways strengthen in directions that favor vigilance over curiosity, reaction over reflection, habit over flexibility. Systems designed for short bursts of survival activity remain active for months or years. Over time, this shifts how a person thinks, what they notice, what they remember, how they interpret ambiguity, and even what feels normal. History provides many examples of environments shaped by chronic stress: war zones, economic depressions, political instability, natural disasters. Individuals who lived through such conditions often reported that even after external danger passed, their inner state did not fully return to baseline. Their nervous systems remained tuned to alertness. The world continued to feel unpredictable. Calm could feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable. Today, chronic stress is less dramatic but no less powerful. It may arise from persistent job insecurity, caregiving burdens, sleep disruption, exposure to constant information, or simply the absence of reliable recovery time. Because it lacks a single dramatic cause, it can also lack a clear endpoint. People adapt to it without realizing adaptation is occurring. This lecture is about that adaptation. It is about how repeated stress signals alter brain circuits, hormone systems, and patterns of attention. It is about why chronic stress changes memory, decision-making, emotional regulation, and physical health. And perhaps most importantly, it is about understanding these changes not as personal weakness or failure, but as the predictable result of a biological system doing exactly what it evolved to do: protect survival, even when protection becomes costly. At its core, this subject helps us understand a question many people quietly carry. Why do I feel different than I used to? Why does calm seem harder to access? Why does the mind return to worry even when nothing urgent is happening? The answers lie not in character, but in neurobiology, shaped by experience over time. This episode will show that chronic stress gradually rewires the brain's structure and function, shifting it towards survival-oriented processing at the expense of flexibility, calm, and long-term well-being. By the end of this exploration, you will gain a clearer understanding of how stress operates beneath awareness, why its effects accumulate rather than simply fade, and how many psychological experiences, anxiety, irritability, mental fatigue, difficulty concentrating, emotional numbness, can be understood as adaptations rather than defects. We will approach this subject calmly and carefully, drawing from neuroscience, psychology, and human experience. not to alarm, but to illuminate. The goal is not to diagnose or to prescribe, but to provide perspective, a way of seeing stress not as a mysterious force, but as a system with understandable mechanisms and consequences. Chapter 1: The Stress Response, a survival system that never turns fully off. To understand how stress rewires the brain over time, we must first understand what stress actually is at a biological level. Stress is not the event itself. It is the body's response to perceived threat or demand. Two people can encounter the same situation and experience very different levels of stress, because what matters is not only what happens, but how the brain interprets it. At the center of this process is a rapid evaluation system deep within the brain. Incoming information from the senses is continuously scanned for signals of danger, uncertainty, or loss of control. When something is judged to be threatening, physically or psychologically, a cascade of physiological changes begins almost instantly. The autonomic nervous system activates, heart rate increases, breathing becomes faster and shallower, blood flow shifts toward large muscle groups, digestion slows, attention narrows, stress hormones, including adrenaline and cortisol, flood the bloodstream. Energy reserves are mobilized. These changes are not accidental. They are optimized for survival in acute emergencies. If a person needed to run, fight, or react immediately, this state would be extremely useful. It prioritizes speed over nuance, action over contemplation. Importantly, this system evolved in environments where threats were typically short-lived. Once the danger passed, the body could return to baseline. Hormone levels would fall, muscles would relax. Normal processes such as digestion, immune function, and tissue repair would resume. Modern stressors often do not allow for that clean resolution. Deadlines recur. Financial worries persist. Social conflicts remain unresolved. News cycles continuously introduce new sources of concern. Sleep may be shortened or fragmented. In such conditions, the stress response is activated repeatedly or remains partially engaged for extended periods. This creates a state sometimes described as chronic activation, not full emergency mode, but not true recovery either. The body hovers in a middle zone of elevated readiness. Cortisol, one of the primary stress hormones, plays a complex role in this process. In the short term, it helps mobilize energy and sharpen attention. Over longer periods, however, elevated cortisol begins to influence brain cells directly. It affects how neurons communicate, how new connections form, and even how certain brain regions grow or shrink. Three areas are especially important: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala functions as an alarm system, detecting potential threats and generating emotional responses such as fear or anger. Chronic stress tends to increase its activity and sensitivity. Over time, it becomes quicker to signal danger, even in ambiguous situations. The hippocampus is involved in memory formation and contextual understanding, distinguishing between past and present, safe and unsafe environments. Prolonged exposure to stress hormones can impair its functioning, making it harder to place experiences in context and easier for past stress to influence present perception. The prefrontal cortex supports higher-order thinking, planning, impulse control, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Chronic stress reduces its effectiveness, particularly in situations requiring patience, flexibility, or complex reasoning. The result is a shift in balance. The brain becomes more reactive and less reflective, more focused on immediate concerns and less able to consider long-term consequences. From a survival standpoint, this makes sense. In dangerous environments, quick reactions matter more than careful deliberation. But when the environment is not truly life-threatening, merely demanding or uncertain, this shift can feel like a loss of control rather than an advantage. Another critical feature of the stress response is that it feeds on perception. Once activated, it biases attention toward potential problems. The brain becomes more likely to notice negative cues, interpret neutral events as threatening, and recall past difficulties more readily than positive experiences. This creates a feedback loop. Stress increases vigilance. Vigilance finds more things to worry about, which maintains stress. Sleep disruption often follows. Elevated arousal makes it harder to fall asleep or stay asleep. Poor sleep, in turn, amplifies stress sensitivity the following day. Cognitive performance declines. Emotional regulation weakens. The threshold for feeling overwhelmed lowers. Over weeks and months, this pattern can become self-reinforcing, not because a person chooses it, but because the underlying biology has shifted. Perhaps the most important insight is that none of this requires conscious awareness. A person may believe they are simply tired, irritable, or unfocused without realizing their nervous system has been operating in a sustained defensive mode. From the outside, it can look like personality change. From the inside, it can feel like something intangible is off. A sense of tension without a clear cause, difficulty relaxing even during free time, a background expectation that something needs attention. In reality, the brain has learned that the world is unpredictable and has adjusted accordingly. This is the beginning of how stress rewires the brain, not through dramatic events alone, but through repetition. Small activations, repeated thousands of times, gradually become the new baseline. And once a state becomes baseline, it no longer feels like stress. It feels like normal. Chapter 2. How stress changes memory, attention, and perception. When stress persists over time, it does not only affect how strongly we react to events. It changes what we notice, what we remember, and how we interpret the world before conscious thought even begins. In other words, chronic stress does not simply intensify experience. It filters experience. It quietly reshapes the lens through which reality is perceived. To understand this, we must consider the brain as a prediction system rather than a passive recorder of events. At every moment, the brain is attempting to anticipate what will happen next based on past experience. It prioritizes information that seems relevant to survival and suppresses what appears unimportant. This process is efficient, but it also means that repeated exposure to stress trains the brain to expect threat, uncertainty, or loss. Memory plays a central role in this training. Under normal conditions, the hippocampus helps encode experiences in context. It allows us to distinguish between then and now, between past danger and present safety. Chronic stress interferes with this process. Elevated stress hormones can impair the formation of detailed, balanced memories while strengthening emotionally charged fragments. As a result, memories formed during prolonged stress often emphasize what was alarming, painful, or unresolved, while neutral or positive details fade into the background. Over time, this bias alters recall. When the brain searches memory to interpret a current situation, it retrieves disproportionately negative examples. This makes the present feel more threatening than it objectively is, not because the person is pessimistic by nature, but because the available evidence in memory is skewed. Attention follows a similar pattern. The brain's attentional systems become tuned to detect potential problems quickly. This is sometimes called hypervigilance, a heightened sensitivity to cues that might signal danger or difficulty. In a genuinely hazardous environment, such sensitivity could be life-saving. In everyday life, however, it can become exhausting. Hypervigilance narrows the field of awareness. Instead of taking in a wide range of information, the mind scans for anomalies, risks, or signs that something is wrong. Neutral stimuli are more likely to be interpreted as meaningful, and ambiguous situations are more likely to be viewed as negative. A delayed response to a message may feel like rejection. A minor bodily sensation may trigger concern. Silence in a conversation may feel tense rather than comfortable. Importantly, this process operates below conscious intention. A person does not choose to interpret the world this way. The brain has learned that caution is safer than openness. Perception itself becomes colored by this learning. The sensory world is not experienced objectively but filtered through expectations. Research in neuroscience shows that perception is partly constructed from top-down signals, predictions generated by the brain, combined with bottom-up sensory input. When stress has trained the brain to expect threat, those predictions shape what is perceived. This is why chronic stress can make environments feel harsher, more chaotic, or less forgiving than they once did. It is not that the external world has necessarily changed. The internal model used to interpret it has. Another subtle effect involves time perception. Stress compresses attention into the present moment, focusing on immediate demands. Long-term thinking becomes more difficult. Planning for the future may feel abstract or overwhelming because the brain is allocating resources toward short-term survival. This can create a sense of being trapped in urgency, where everything feels pressing and nothing feels fully resolved. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift perspective, consider alternatives, or generate creative solutions, also declines. The mind gravitates toward familiar patterns, even when those patterns are not helpful. Repetitive thinking, rumination, and difficulty letting go of concerns are common outcomes of this rigidity. Again, this is not a failure of discipline. It is a consequence of neural systems optimized for efficiency under pressure. Emotional memory becomes particularly influential. Experiences associated with strong negative emotion are stored with high priority because they may contain lessons relevant to future survival. However, when stress is chronic, this prioritization can become disproportionate. The brain may repeatedly revisit distressing memories or imagine scenarios, reinforcing the sense that danger is ongoing. Sleep disruption compounds these effects. During healthy sleep, the brain consolidates memories, integrates emotional experiences, and clears metabolic byproducts from neural tissue. Chronic stress often fragments sleep, reducing these restorative processes. Without adequate integration, memories remain vivid and intrusive, rather than gradually softening into narrative form. Over months or years, these changes can alter identity-level experience. A person may begin to feel that they are fundamentally anxious, pessimistic, or easily overwhelmed, when in fact their cognitive systems have been shaped by sustained exposure to stress signals. The distinction matters because traits feel permanent, whereas adaptation suggests the possibility of change. Social perception is affected as well. Humans are highly attuned to social cues, and chronic stress can increase sensitivity to perceived judgment, conflict, or rejection. Facial expressions may be interpreted as more negative than intended. Neutral interactions may feel draining. Trust may become harder to establish because the brain has learned to anticipate potential harm. This shift can gradually reduce social engagement, which in turn removes one of the most powerful buffers against stress: supportive connection. Isolation then reinforces the perception that one must handle threats alone, perpetuating the cycle. Decision-making also becomes more conservative. Risk avoidance increases, sometimes even when risks are minimal. The brain favors options that reduce uncertainty immediately, rather than those that might yield greater long-term benefit. This can lead to patterns of behavior that feel safe in the short term but restrictive over time. Perhaps most striking is how these changes can occur without dramatic symptoms. A person may function effectively in daily tasks while quietly experiencing reduced enjoyment, diminished curiosity, and a persistent sense of mental load. Life may feel narrower, more effortful, less spontaneous. In this way, chronic stress reshapes not only reaction but experience itself. It reorganizes the hierarchy of what feels important, what feels possible, and what feels safe. Yet it is crucial to recognize that these changes are not signs of damage in a moral or personal sense. They are evidence of learning. The brain is a plastic organ, constantly adjusting to patterns in the environment. Under repeated stress, it learns to prioritize caution, efficiency, and rapid detection of problems, because those strategies appear necessary. Understanding this can transform how we interpret our own minds. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" we might ask, "What has my nervous system learned to expect?" That question opens the door to a more compassionate and scientifically grounded perspective, one that acknowledges both the cost of chronic stress and the remarkable adaptability of the human brain. Chapter 3: How Chronic Stress Alters Emotion, Motivation, and the Capacity for Pleasure. As stress reshapes memory and perception, it also reaches deeper into the emotional architecture of the brain. Over time, chronic stress does not simply make a person feel more tense or worried. It changes how emotions arise, how long they last, how intensely they are experienced, and even what emotions are accessible at all. Many people assume that stress means feeling too much, too anxious, too reactive, too overwhelmed. But an equally common outcome is feeling less joy, less enthusiasm, less curiosity, less emotional range. Life can begin to feel muted, flattened, or heavy without a clear reason why. At the biological level, this shift involves changes in networks that regulate emotion and reward. The brain's emotional systems evolve to guide behavior toward survival-enhancing outcomes: seek nourishment, avoid danger, bond with others, explore beneficial opportunities. Pleasure and motivation are not luxuries. They are signals that something supports life. Chronic stress interferes with these signals by reallocating resources toward vigilance and away from exploration. One key player in this process is dopamine, a neurotransmitter often associated with reward and motivation. Dopamine does not simply produce pleasure, it drives the anticipation of reward and the energy to pursue goals. Under prolonged stress, dopamine signaling can become dysregulated. The brain reduces investment in activities that are not immediately necessary for survival. Tasks that once felt interesting or satisfying may begin to feel effortful or pointless. Starting projects becomes harder. Sustaining attention becomes draining. Even accomplishments may produce only brief or muted satisfaction. This phenomenon is sometimes experienced subjectively as loss of motivation. But from the brain's perspective, it is a recalibration of priorities. If the environment appears uncertain or threatening, conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary risk may be adaptive. Unfortunately, this protective strategy can also reduce engagement with life, reinforcing a cycle of withdrawal and low stimulation. Emotional reactivity shifts as well. The amygdala, already sensitized by chronic stress, continues to amplify signals related to fear, anger, or frustration. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, which normally helps regulate emotional responses, operates less efficiently. The result is a system that is quicker to activate strong emotions, but slower to calm down afterward. Small provocations may trigger disproportionately large responses, followed by lingering agitation or exhaustion. Yet paradoxically, alongside this heightened reactivity, many people experience emotional numbness. This is not a contradiction, but another adaptation. When emotional intensity becomes overwhelming or persistent, the nervous system may dampen overall responsiveness as a form of protection. Instead of oscillating between extreme highs and lows, the system reduces amplitude altogether. Positive emotions become blunted along with negative ones. Joy feels distant, excitement short-lived, affection less vivid. From the outside, this can be misinterpreted as indifference. From the inside, it often feels like disconnection, as though life is happening behind a pane of glass. Activities that once provided comfort or meaning may no longer produce the same emotional resonance. This can be particularly distressing because it undermines the very experiences that might otherwise support recovery. Chronic stress also influences how the brain processes uncertainty. Under normal conditions, uncertainty can be stimulating, even exciting. It creates space for curiosity and creativity. Under sustained stress, uncertainty becomes aversive. The brain treats the unknown as potentially dangerous, leading to a preference for predictability, even if predictability is dull or limiting. This can reduce willingness to try new experiences, meet new people, or pursue unfamiliar goals. Motivation, therefore, becomes tied less to aspiration and more to avoidance. Behavior is guided by the desire to prevent negative outcomes rather than achieve positive ones. A person may continue functioning, working, caring for responsibilities, maintaining routines, but with a sense that life is driven by obligation rather than interest. Energy regulation is deeply intertwined with these changes. Stress hormones mobilize energy for immediate action, but when activation is chronic, energy systems become strained. Sleep disturbances impair restoration. Muscle tension consumes metabolic resources. Cognitive effort increases because tasks require more conscious control when automatic processes are disrupted. The subjective result is fatigue that does not fully resolve with rest. Importantly, this fatigue is not simply physical. It is mental and emotional as well. A sense that even enjoyable activities require effort to initiate. This can lead to guilt or self-criticism, especially in cultures that equate productivity with worth. However, from a neurobiological perspective, the system is conserving energy because it perceives ongoing demand. Another subtle shift involves emotional learning. Positive experiences normally reinforce themselves through repetition. Enjoyment encourages re-engagement. Chronic stress weakens this reinforcement loop. Pleasant moments may occur but fail to leave a lasting trace, making it harder to build momentum toward well-being. Negative experiences, by contrast, continue to imprint strongly, maintaining the bias described earlier. Relationships are affected too. Emotional availability decreases when internal resources are depleted. Patience shortens. Sensitivity to conflict increases. Communication may become more defensive or withdrawn. Loved ones may interpret these changes personally, not realizing they reflect systemic strain rather than lack of care. Over time, identity can begin to reorganize around these altered emotional patterns. A person may conclude that they have become less joyful, less driven, less resilient, or less connected than they once were. In reality, these are emergent properties of a nervous system operating under sustained load. It is crucial to emphasize that the brain does not make these adjustments arbitrarily. They are attempts to maintain stability under pressure. When resources are limited and threats seem persistent, choosing alertness over leisure, predictability over novelty, and conservation over expansion may increase short-term survival. The cost is long-term vitality. Understanding this trade-off can reduce the sense of personal failure that often accompanies chronic stress. What feels like weakness may actually be the result of a system working overtime to protect against perceived danger. Perhaps the most profound effect is the gradual narrowing of emotional life. Instead of a wide spectrum of feelings, curiosity, contentment, excitement, serenity, affection, experience becomes dominated by a smaller set of states related to tension, fatigue, or guarded neutrality. This narrowing can make time feel repetitive, days blending together without memorable peaks. Yet even in this state, the capacity for emotion has not disappeared. It has been suppressed, redirected, or overshadowed by survival priorities. The underlying circuitry remains capable of change because the brain remains plastic throughout life. What has been learned through repetition can, under different conditions, be relearned. Recognizing this possibility is important, not as a promise of quick transformation, but as reassurance that the current state is not fixed destiny. It is a pattern shaped by circumstances and sustained by biology, powerful but not immutable. In this way, chronic stress alters not only how we respond to the world, but how much of the world we are able to feel. It reshapes motivation from pursuit to protection, emotion from richness to constraint, pleasure from expectation to rarity. Understanding these changes prepares us to examine the next layer of impact: how prolonged stress affects decision-making, behavior, and the sense of agency. The feeling that one can influence one's own life, rather than merely react to it. Chapter 4. How chronic stress reshapes decision-making, habits, and the sense of control. As stress continues to influence emotion and motivation, its effects extend into the domain of action. The choices we make, the risks we take or avoid, and the degree to which we feel capable of directing our own lives. Decision-making is not a purely rational process. It is deeply dependent on emotional regulation, memory, attention, and energy. When those underlying systems are altered by chronic stress, behavior changes in ways that can seem puzzling or frustrating even to the person experiencing them. One of the most consistent findings in neuroscience is that prolonged stress shifts control of behavior away from flexible, goal-directed systems and toward rigid, habitual systems. The brain contains multiple pathways for guiding action. One pathway evaluates options, considers long-term consequences, and adjusts behavior based on new information. Another pathway relies on learned routines, patterns that require little conscious thought and can be executed quickly. Under conditions of safety and adequate resources, the brain can afford to use the flexible system. It can pause, deliberate, and choose. Under stress, speed, and efficiency become more valuable than nuance. Habit circuits, centered in structures such as the basal ganglia, take precedence because they demand less cognitive effort. The result is behavior that feels automatic, repeating familiar responses even when they no longer serve current goals. This shift explains why people under chronic stress often report feeling stuck in patterns they wish they could change. It is not simply a matter of willpower. The neural balance has tilted toward routines that were previously reinforced, whether those routines involve overworking, procrastination, avoidance, compulsive checking, emotional eating, withdrawal, or other coping behaviors. Once a habit loop is established under stress, it tends to persist because it reduces immediate uncertainty, even if it creates long-term difficulties. Risk assessment also changes. Stress narrows attention to potential losses, making negative outcomes appear more salient than positive possibilities. This loss sensitivity can lead to overly cautious decisions, such as avoiding opportunities that carry even minor uncertainty. Alternatively, in some contexts, stress can produce the opposite effect: impulsive risk-taking driven by the desire for quick relief or escape. Both patterns reflect the same underlying principle: the prioritization of immediate emotional resolution over carefully weighed long-term planning. The prefrontal cortex plays a central role here. It supports impulse control, future thinking, and the integration of complex information. Chronic stress impairs its functioning through both chemical and structural changes. When prefrontal regulation weakens, behavior becomes more reactive. Decisions are influenced more heavily by immediate feelings, external pressures, or ingrained habits than by deliberate evaluation. This can manifest as difficulty prioritizing tasks, trouble initiating action, or a tendency to jump from one urgent demand to another without a clear sense of direction. The day may feel full of activity yet lacking progress, creating a perception of inefficiency that further increases stress. Time perception, already altered by stress, contributes to this pattern. When the brain is oriented toward short-term survival, future consequences carry less emotional weight. Long-range goals may feel abstract or disconnected from present reality. Planning requires mental simulation of a future state, and that simulation depends on cognitive resources that stress has depleted. Another consequence is decision fatigue. Every choice consumes mental energy, and when baseline arousal is high, the cost of decision-making increases. As fatigue accumulates, the brain seeks shortcuts. It may default to the easiest option, defer decisions indefinitely, or rely on external cues rather than internal priorities. This can create a sense of drifting through obligations rather than steering one's course. The experience of control, sometimes called agency, is particularly vulnerable. Agency arises when a person perceives a reliable link between actions and outcomes. Chronic stress often disrupts this link. Situations may feel unpredictable, outcomes uncertain, or efforts ineffective. Over time, this can produce a learned expectation that actions do not significantly change circumstances. Importantly, this expectation is not necessarily inaccurate in environments where demands are high and feedback is inconsistent. The brain adapts by reducing investment in proactive behavior. If control seems limited, conserving energy becomes rational. Unfortunately, this adaptation can generalize beyond the original context, leading to passivity even in areas where influence is possible. Motivation then shifts from shaping the future to managing the present. Tasks are approached with the aim of preventing problems rather than creating improvements. Creativity declines because it requires tolerance for uncertainty and willingness to explore untested paths, capacities that stress suppresses. Social decision-making changes as well. Interactions may become more guarded. Trust is extended cautiously, if at all. Conflict may be avoided to conserve emotional resources, or conversely, small disagreements may escalate quickly because regulatory mechanisms are strained. Cooperation requires bandwidth, the ability to consider another person's perspective while maintaining one's own. Under stress, this bandwidth shrinks. Habits related to self-care are often among the first casualties. Activities that support long-term well-being, exercise, balanced nutrition, restorative leisure, reflective practices, demand planning and effort. When the brain is focused on immediate demands, these activities may feel optional or expendable. Ironically, their absence further reduces resilience, deepening the cycle. Another subtle effect involves reward timing. Chronic stress increases preference for immediate rewards over delayed ones. This phenomenon, sometimes called temporal discounting, reflects the brain's uncertainty about the future. If tomorrow feels unpredictable, benefits available today become more compelling. This can influence financial decisions, health behaviors, and lifestyle choices in ways that favor short-term comfort over long-term stability. Over extended periods, these patterns can reshape life trajectories. Opportunities may be missed, not because they were impossible, but because the cognitive and emotional conditions required to pursue them were absent. Looking back, a person might wonder why they did not act differently, not realizing how constrained their decision-making systems had become. Yet even within this constraint, the brain continues to seek equilibrium. Habitual behaviors often serve regulatory functions, providing moments of relief or predictability. Understanding this function can foster compassion rather than judgment. Behaviors that appear irrational from the outside often make sense as attempts to manage internal load. The sense of being carried along by circumstances rather than directing them can be deeply unsettling. Humans derive psychological stability from the belief that choices matter. When that belief erodes, anxiety may increase, or apathy may take its place. Both responses reflect the same underlying uncertainty about control. However, it is essential to remember that these changes are context-dependent. They arise from prolonged exposure to stress signals and can shift when conditions change. The brain's preference for habits, caution, or immediacy is not a permanent trait, but a state shaped by experience. In this way, chronic stress alters not only what we feel and think, but what we do. The patterns of action that gradually construct a life. It moves behavior toward efficiency, predictability, and short-term stability, sometimes at the cost of growth, spontaneity, and agency. Understanding this prepares us for the next and final chapter of the core exploration, how stress embeds itself in the body, influencing physical health, energy regulation, and the feedback loop between physiology and psychology. Because the brain does not operate in isolation, it is part of a system, and the body keeps score of prolonged strain. Chapter 5. How chronic stress reshapes the body and creates a self-reinforcing loop. Up to this point, we have explored how chronic stress alters perception, emotion, motivation, and decision-making within the brain. But the brain does not exist apart from the body. It is an organ embedded in a biological system, continuously receiving signals from the heart, lungs, immune system, gut, muscles, and endocrine glands. When stress persists, the body changes alongside the brain, and those physical changes send feedback that further shapes mental experience. Over time, stress becomes not just something one feels, but something one inhabits. At the center of this process is the stress physiology known as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, often abbreviated as the HPA axis. This system regulates the release of cortisol and other hormones that mobilize energy and coordinate the body's response to demand. In short bursts, activation of the HPA axis is adaptive. It prepares the organism to meet challenges and then returns to baseline once the challenge passes. Under chronic conditions, however, this cycle becomes dysregulated. Cortisol levels may remain elevated or fluctuate irregularly. Instead of a clear pattern of activation and recovery, the body experiences a persistent signal that something requires vigilance. This state affects nearly every major system. Sleep is often the first domain to show disruption. Healthy sleep depends on a coordinated decrease in arousal, a drop in core body temperature, and a predictable circadian rhythm of hormone release. Chronic stress interferes with these processes. Elevated evening cortisol can delay sleep onset, while nighttime hyperarousal may produce frequent awakenings or shallow sleep. Even when total sleep time appears sufficient, its restorative quality may be reduced. Sleep loss then amplifies stress reactivity the following day. The brain becomes more sensitive to negative stimuli, less able to regulate emotion, and less efficient in cognitive tasks. Pain perception increases. Appetite hormones shift, often increasing cravings for high-energy foods. Thus, insufficient sleep does not merely accompany stress, it intensifies it, creating a cycle that can persist for months or years. The immune system is also deeply affected. Acute stress can temporarily enhance certain immune functions, preparing the body to deal with injury or infection. Chronic stress, by contrast, tends to suppress protective responses while promoting low-grade inflammation. This inflammatory state is subtle, not the dramatic swelling associated with injury, but a background level of immune activation that can contribute to fatigue, mood changes, and vulnerability to illness. Inflammatory signals can cross into the brain, influencing neurotransmitter systems and neural activity. Research suggests that persistent inflammation may be associated with symptoms such as low motivation, reduced pleasure, and cognitive fog. From an evolutionary perspective, this response conserves energy for healing, but when no physical injury is present, it can feel like unexplained exhaustion. Muscle tension is another common manifestation. Stress prepares the body for action by increasing muscle readiness. When activation is prolonged, Muscles may remain partially contracted for extended periods, especially in the neck, shoulders, jaw, and back. This tension consumes energy, restricts blood flow, and can produce discomfort or pain. The discomfort itself becomes an additional stressor, reinforcing the sense that something is wrong. Cardiovascular changes accumulate as well. Elevated heart rate and blood pressure during stress are normal short-term responses, but sustained elevation increases wear on the vascular system. The body is essentially operating as though it must be ready to respond at any moment, even in the absence of immediate threat. Digestive function often shifts in parallel. The stress response diverts resources away from digestion towards systems needed for rapid action. Chronic activation can lead to irregular appetite, gastrointestinal discomfort, or changes in nutrient absorption. The gut and brain communicate bidirectionally through neural, hormonal, and immune pathways, meaning digestive disturbances can influence mood and cognition, and vice versa. Energy regulation becomes particularly complex. Many people experiencing chronic stress report simultaneous feelings of fatigue and restlessness, tired but unable to relax. This paradox reflects competing signals within the nervous system. The sympathetic branch promotes alertness and readiness, while depleted energy reserves signal the need for rest. The result is a state of wired exhaustion, where the body cannot fully power down nor fully restore. Pain sensitivity may increase over time as well. Stress can lower the threshold at which sensations are perceived as painful, a process known as central sensitization. Minor aches may feel more intense, and recovery from physical strain may be slower. Pain, in turn, acts as a stressor, maintaining physiological activation. Importantly, these bodily changes feed back into the brain through a process sometimes called interoception, the sensing of internal bodily states. The brain continuously interprets signals from the body to estimate whether conditions are safe or threatening. Elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, muscle tension, or gastrointestinal discomfort can all be interpreted as signs that something is wrong, even if the original cause was psychological. Thus, the body becomes evidence for the brain's prediction that danger or demand persists. This creates a powerful feedback loop. Stress alters physiology. Altered physiology signals threat. Threat perception maintains stress. Over long durations, this loop can make calm feel unfamiliar. When arousal has been high for months or years, the nervous system may treat relaxation as unusual or even unsafe. Some individuals report difficulty sitting quietly or disengaging from activity because stillness allows awareness of internal tension that is otherwise masked by distraction. Hormonal systems beyond cortisol are involved as well. Chronic stress can influence thyroid function, reproductive hormones, and metabolic processes, contributing to changes in weight, temperature regulation, or menstrual cycles. These changes further affect mood and energy, illustrating how deeply integrated the stress response is across bodily systems. One of the most important concepts here is allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear on the body from repeated adaptation to stress. Unlike acute strain, which resolves after recovery, allostatic load builds gradually. Its effects may be subtle at first, emerging as decreased resilience rather than overt illness. Tasks that were once easy become taxing. Recovery from exertion takes longer. Minor setbacks feel disproportionately draining. Yet even this state reflects adaptation, not failure. The body is attempting to maintain stability under conditions that demand continuous adjustment. It is allocating resources where they appear most necessary, even if that allocation reduces capacity elsewhere. Social and environmental factors can either buffer or exacerbate these processes. Supportive relationships, predictable routines, and safe environments provide signals of security that help counteract stress activation. Conversely, isolation, unpredictability, or persistent conflict reinforce the perception that vigilance is required. Over time, the boundary between psychological and physical stress dissolves. Emotional strain produces bodily symptoms. Bodily symptoms reinforce emotional strain. The distinction between mind and body becomes less meaningful because both are components of a single adaptive system. Perhaps the most profound implication is that chronic stress is not merely a mental experience, but a whole organism state. It reshapes sleep, immunity, metabolism, pain perception, and cardiovascular function, while those physical changes reshape thought and emotion. Understanding this interconnectedness can reduce the tendency to blame oneself for symptoms that arise from systemic processes. Even so, it is equally important to recognize that these adaptations are not permanent fixtures. The same plasticity that allows stress to reshape the body also allows recovery when conditions permit. Physiological systems can recalibrate, though often gradually rather than suddenly. In this way, chronic stress embeds itself in the body, creating a self-reinforcing loop between brain and physiology. It becomes not just something that happens, but something that is continuously recreated by the interaction of internal systems. Understanding this loop prepares us to step back and consider the full picture. How these biological, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral changes fit together, and what it means for how we interpret our own experiences. Part 6, Conclusion. Stress, when viewed moment by moment, can seem like a series of isolated reactions. A tense day, a poor night's sleep, a period of worry that eventually fades. But when viewed across months or years, a different pattern emerges. Stress is cumulative. It leaves traces. It shapes the systems through which we experience the world. This episode has shown that chronic stress gradually rewires the brain and body towards survival-oriented functioning. Memory becomes biased toward threat. Attention narrows. Emotion oscillates between reactivity and numbness. Motivation shifts from pursuit to protection. Decision-making favors habits and immediacy. Physiological systems operate in a state of sustained readiness. Together, these changes create a coherent adaptation, a human organism optimized for endurance under pressure. Understanding this reframes many common experiences: difficulty concentrating, persistent fatigue, irritability, loss of enjoyment, sleep disturbance, physical tension, or a sense of being overwhelmed are not random flaws. They are interconnected outcomes of a system attempting to maintain stability in an environment perceived as demanding or uncertain. At the same time, recognizing stress as an adaptive process reveals something hopeful. Adaptations are shaped by conditions, and conditions can change. The brain and body remain plastic throughout life, capable of reorganizing in response to new patterns of experience. Recovery is rarely instantaneous because the systems involved operate gradually, but change is possible because the mechanisms that produce the current state continue to function. Perhaps the most valuable insight is one of perspective. Instead of viewing stress responses as personal weakness or evidence of inadequacy, we can see them as evidence of a powerful survival system doing its work, sometimes too well. This perspective invites compassion, not indulgence, but understanding of the forces at play beneath behavior and feeling. It also highlights the importance of environments, relationships, and rhythms that signal safety as well as demand. Humans are not designed for perpetual activation. Periods of rest, connection, and predictability are not luxuries, but biological necessities that allow the stress response to cycle properly. Ultimately, stress rewires the brain over time, not because the brain is fragile, but because it is responsive. It learns from what is repeated. If pressure is repeated, it learns vigilance. If uncertainty is repeated, it learns caution. If recovery is repeated, it learns calm. Seen in this light, the question is not whether stress will shape us. It inevitably does. but how aware we are of that shaping and how gently we interpret its effects. As you reflect on this exploration, you might simply notice how your own experiences align with these patterns, without judgment or urgency to change anything immediately. Understanding itself can be stabilizing. It transforms confusion into clarity and self-criticism into curiosity. The human nervous system is not an adversary to overcome, but a partner trying to ensure survival. When we understand its language, even its most uncomfortable signals can be seen as communication rather than failure. Thank you for spending this time in careful thought and quiet examination. This has been The Listening Room, a space for clarity, patience, and understanding. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you for listening.